As we're already pretty much behind schedule, no long introductions. It is my pleasure to introduce John Taylor from the British Museum. He will have his talk, Visualization, a Cuneiform Collection. As it is a remote talk, it's also the first remote talk we have here. I kind of hope everything runs well. John, if you don't hear anything from us back during your presentation, let's say that is a signal that everything is going well, okay?
Okay.
So please, you have the audio.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everybody. So in Assyriology today, we take for granted access to lots of large data sets. And traditionally, the focus has been on access to textual data with cataloging information as metadata. The question then arises, what else can we do with that? I'm interested in doing it the other way around, using the cataloging information as the data set. Now, people aren't very good at interpreting large amounts of information, so data visualization tools offer us a huge opportunity. I must admit, I'm a little self-conscious at this point. I'm rather hesitant to present something so basic in this kind of forum. We've seen all these transformative projects, and there's me about to bang on about glorified bar charts, but I hope I don't waste your time in the next 20 minutes. I don't remember seeing this used in Assyriology, and I think we're missing something. And I'd also like to highlight the potential of categories of data that aren't captured in existing catalogues. At the same time, it's important for us not to lose sight of who the we is. Not everybody, yet at least, has specialized technical skills or institutional financial support for more technical approaches. The approach I'm using here is very low, has very low barriers for entry. It's very powerful, but it's free and it's easy to use. It's also collaborative and easy to publish. It doesn't have to last forever. You can use it and then throw it away. It's AI power with no coding required. It's drag and drop, one-click technology. Anybody can do this. So a new researcher starting out in Assyriology has access to lots of data. The issue is more the opposite of what it used to be. How do you pick out what you need from the mass of everything else? So I would argue that this technology can be a useful first step to identify relevant data, to check it for completeness, consistency, granularity, and to help shape the research question, as well as practical things like check the viability of choosing a particular corpus to work on. Can you travel to the relevant institutions, for example? And you may also use it to identify what technology you might need to learn to address your research question in detail. You do need to go and spend time and money learning social network analysis, for example. So let's start. I have been spending time on collection history with a focus on the British Museum, of course. And recently, my colleague Isabel MacDonald published an interesting article looking at the British Museum collection as a whole. And when I looked at her results, I saw a very different picture from what I had in mind based on my own work on the Cuneiform material. So in this chart here, you can see she charts the volume of acquisitions over time. You can see an increase in the rate of acquisitions over here around the 1820s, and it slows down around the 1880s. Then there's this huge peak in between the 1960s and the 1990s. Right. Obviously, when you look at aggregated data like this, it is going to conceal some of the variation that must lie beneath. But it does also provide important context for understanding components of the collection, such as I've been working on. The question then is, what are the commonalities, such as maybe museum collecting policy? What are the specificities of that part of the collection? And we can see an example of this here from the same article. That big bump at the end of the 20th century, this is to do with specificity of the UK. It's infrastructure work and resulting legislation that goes around that regarding what happens in terms of archaeology. So that is the impact on the British Museum collection. So that won't be true for Cuneiform, of course. So I wanted to turn next, of course, to the actual Cuneiform, but I must give you a caveat here, in that what I'm about to show you is not just very simple, it's premature. I put it together specially for this event. The data set isn't quite ready yet. So please don't take anything you see too literally. That said, it should give you a reasonable impression of what can already be done right now and the general picture itself should be fairly sound. I've kept the visualizations fairly simple, and not least because when you have somebody else manipulating dynamic visualizations, it very quickly becomes dizzying and confusing. So I try to keep it really simple. The plus side of that, of course, is that in order to do any of this, and in fact all of this, takes very little time. So here it is. This is a first look at the big picture of the cuneiform part of the British Museum collection, and you see a very different profile. So here's the 1820s. There's no uptick. This is the Nineveh excavations. Here we see Sippar and Babylon, and of course that British archaeological bump doesn't exist in the 20th century. We can break it down a little bit. So here we can see three different parts of the collections. On the top we have the cuneiform material. We might say, okay, well, how does that relate to collecting generally in terms of ancient Iraq, say? So below that is the archaeological material, the uninscribed material from the same places. And below that is archaeological material from the later periods from the same places. And you see three very different profiles, and there's a lot we could say about those. Let's dig a little bit deeper. You can start to look at things like what kind of objects have cuneiform. There's not a particular surprise that most of them are on tablets. That in itself isn't very interesting, but where it does get interesting is when you start to combine that with other data categories later. What I think is missing from existing collections is method of acquisition and date of acquisition and things like that, sort of the dynamism of collections. So if we go back to Isabel's article, you can see here the proportion of acquisitions that are donations is marked in this grey colour. And throughout pretty much all of the museum's history, in numerical terms, donations have been a huge part of the acquisition of the collection. If we switch now to the cuneiform again, you see it's not. If we divide out that same profile that we saw into three categories of donated, excavated, purchased, we can start to play with it. Let's have a look where the excavations, say there we have Nineveh, Sippar and Babylon. What is purchased, slightly later period, again different, it's a larger number of smaller consignments coming in, happening at a later date. And then donations is again a completely different profile. This bump here is a single donation. We'll come to that in a moment. And of course, with data like this kind of scale is not always terribly helpful. So you can sort of zoom in without learning any code whatsoever, without having to bother writing a query, and just instantly see data on the kind of scale that is sympathetic to what you're trying to do. If we align these things, you can see three different profiles, but of course they're not entirely distinct. There is this overlap in this period here between the excavation and the purchase. And that makes sense in a way, in that a lot of these sites are identified when material from unofficial excavations comes on the market. And of course, the question is, where did you get that from? And then there are official excavations. And then alongside the official excavations, because of the higher profile, you get further unofficial excavations. And that relationship can be explored in more detail. Okay, so let's dig a little deeper. So we can have a look at our slice of the pie that is the excavated material. We can see who are the excavators. So here we have Hormuzd Rassam, and you can see that he accounts for that much of the British Museum's entire cuneiform part of the collection. That's quite a lot, obviously. Then we can slide over to the purchase material. We can have a list of, oops, sorry, try again. A bit fiddly on a small screen. So all of these people who have sold cuneiform to the museum. The biggest single seller is Ibrahim Jeju, not a huge surprise. And there's his slice of the pie. Donations over here in numerical terms much smaller. So you saw that large spike in the early 21st century. This is British School of Archaeology in Iraq's excavations at Nimrud. In fact, this slice here is also Nimrud in the 1950s. So one of the things that I need to do is add an extra level of information in the database relating to when this material is excavated. So there's if you think about describing the origin of material, there are different points in the process you can choose, which obviously distorts the data that you're producing. So 3/4 of donations come from excavations at Nimrud, and there's a number of smaller donations that make up the rest. Let's move on. Sorry, Eddie, give me a sec. Sorry, that's the small one. Let's dig again in more depth in the purchases of material, and we can display different categories of information, so we can come back to our object types and the periods. And when you put all of them on the screen, you can't really see very much, but we can scroll down and we say, okay, let's pick Ibrahim Jeju again, and we can see the consignments that he sold, how many were in them, what period they were, what type of tablet they were, and all this kind of thing. We can add in other people. So let's see, let's have Salim Homzi. You can see he's operating at a slightly different date, but he's overlapping. And then we put in, I don't know, let's have Naaman in here. You can start to see the patterns of how these people are interacting. Of course, we know something about who these dealers are, so you can pull things around, and the numbers and the other information updates dynamically. If I can get my next page. There we obviously look at where the material comes from and slice that according to all things like type of object or date or whatever. And so you see some of the bigger sites, Sippar, Nineveh, and Girsu. I'll come back to Nineveh and Girsu again in a moment, and we can separate it out. So Iraq obviously accounts for the majority of the material. We have a look at Syria. We have much smaller numbers, and you can see actually there's probably a very close correlation between the site and the period, single period site acquisitions from Syria. Move on. Oops. I'm trying to edit. We can look, of course, at the date of acquisition and the method of acquisition and correlate that with the country of origin. So we pick Iraq again because there's no discernible change. We pick Syria, automatically updates, and you can see the excavation accounts for all of the material from Syria, which is of course a very different profile from some of the other places. So then we pull apart two of the larger sites that represent the cuneiform collection at the museum, Nineveh and Girsu, two of the sites that I've been working with a lot at the moment. So we pick Nineveh, and it tells us that this much has been excavated, also some purchased, and this is when everything happened. And one of the surprises about that, I guess, is that there hasn't been more material that was unofficially excavated and then put on the market and purchased, given how early and how status that material was. We look at Girsu, pictures the opposite. Everything in the museum from that site was purchased, and you can see purchased at a slightly later date. That's not particularly detailed. We look in more detail. So in the case of Nineveh, we look at where is this material, and we're talking basically here about Ashurbanipal's library. It's no surprise that most of the material is in the British Museum, which obviously distorts the picture. So we can separate out the British Museum and say, okay, where else is this material? And here we go. And if we wanted, of course, we could drill down and we could look at what's in Chicago, and we'd find out that it's mostly prism fragments, etc., etc. Something to note for immediate purposes is that the number of institutions, the number of places around the world where this material is dispersed is relatively low compared to somewhere like Girsu. So there is no typical site, say. It's dispersed to more than 200 different locations around the world. At Umar is even worse. It's something like 400 sites around the world. And I'm very grateful here, I must say, to Manuel Molina for sharing the data that allowed me to produce these visuals to contrast with Nineveh. So we can do simple things like look at the Ur3 corpus and say what proportion of it is represented by Girsu, say, and it's huge. And then we can say, okay, what country is it in? And what I've done in these slides is to add a bit of depth, and you can do this. I just haven't done it before because it would be too confusing, but you can say, okay, let's look at France. And this is great because the kind of data sets we produce are hierarchical, and this is business software, which is very much set up for hierarchy. So we can drill down, we say, okay, most of it's in Paris. You look in Paris, which institutions is it in, and all of the figures for what it is and where it is and everything else updates dynamically. So you don't have to bother making 1001 graphs for everything you want to look at. You can move around as you wish. You can say, okay, let's look at the 3 tablets. tablets that are really Earth-free. Okay, let's look at Amarsuén, year 8, and you keep drilling down and down and down, and everything changes, and you say, okay, let's look at Amarsuén tablets in the Istanbul collection for some, and you could get extra data like that. So obviously you can imagine what is possible. The kinds of questions we can ask now are not all new, of course. So 50 years ago, Tom Jones came up with this graphic showing the complementary temporal distributions between tablets from the official and unofficial excavations at Kursu. And he could show something quite meaningful with that. Anybody can do this now, and so much more, and very quickly. It's something so simple, you could actually even set it as a student exercise, which I think would be a very useful thing as part of training in data literacy in Assyriology. Here's a data set, go and have a look at it, see if you can clean it, analyze it, tell me what you can make of it. That'd be a very practical thing to do. It would work very well alongside some of the other technologies that we have already seen and are seeing later in the next couple of days. It'd be quite useful to automate archival reconstruction, for example. So we could say use machine learning to tag tablets based on formatting features or script, add that to explicit data from the text about personal names or keywords, use social network analysis to identify groupings, add in geodata, map the distributions of groupings over time and across space, try and find out where groups of tablets have moved around and reconstruct what might have been once. That's some time away. In the shorter term, we could do things like instantly map tablet typologies over time and space, or something just as simple as a visual index of large tablet catalogs. At the moment, it's still very heavily text-based, and it's slightly less the case now, but there is a certain amount of technical terminology you have to know. You have to know what the options are and how to spell it, how to format it. With a visual index, it's a much easier way in, and it's much more flexible. You can start to browse as well as search, which I think is useful. What I'd really like to see is an interactive map showing the sites where cuneiform material was found, linked to the places where it's now curated, with a timeline showing when everything happened, which you could then annotate with information like historical events, history of excavations, antiquities laws, things like that, connected also to the people who were involved in those movements. We could do things like explore the antiquities trade. Did dealers create homogeneous or heterogeneous batches? How did that change over time, or depending who they're selling to? What effect did the volume of material in circulation have, or the appearance of new buyers in America? I think these kinds of very simple tools would be really very helpful for research purposes, also as a teaching research and a teaching resource, and something we could use for public engagement too, to build a bit of a bridge between the rather arcane world in which we operate and the public on whose benefit we are doing that work ultimately. And the great thing is that in this kind of software, you can narrow down the material you want, and you can download the results, and there's your starting corpus. So a lot of the hard work is taking it away from you. So what you're able to do is concentrate your time on doing the actual research. So I've seen that there's a couple of projects operating in this kind of area. I need to look more closely at what they're actually planning to do and what they have done, and I'll be in contact. But if anybody is interested in creating this kind of resource and would like to collaborate in some way, I'd be delighted to hear from you. So thanks for your attention.
Hi, I'm Matthew Ong from Berkeley. I don't think you showed it in those slides you had, but presumably, say, with more recent excavations or in some other sources, you could connect, say, archaeological find data to some of these objects in a way that, like, say, the excavation in Nineveh, or, where things are found, or in what context. Have you thought about doing that?
I've kind of kept away from the recent excavations at the moment. Yeah, I mean, theoretically it would be possible. I haven't really given a lot of thought to how we could use it in the immediate future, because the current excavations are rather delicate in terms of who gets to publish and what happens first. There's a sequence and set of permissions. So I've kind of steered away from that. My primary interest at the moment has been in the historic, what happened in 19th, 20th centuries, just to sort of understand the background. But yeah, it would be fascinating to do that kind of work. It's a good idea.
No, so let's thank John again.